right, guys, welcome back. Greg Everett here with Ursula Garza, of course. Before we get started, real quick, we've posted a bunch of our upcoming seminars for 2017. We're going to be in Las Vegas, January 21st, 22nd, New Zealand, January 28th, 29th, Iceland, May 27th and 28th. Remember, Iceland is the one that's not as icy as Greenland. St. Louis, September 16th through 17th, and Miami, November 4th through 5th. All the U.S. dates I will be doing myself. So if you want to come hang out with me, you can for a small fee. And you can go to catalystathletics.com and then hit the link that says seminars, education, go to seminar schedule. Get all your registration stuff signed up there. You can do the regular old seminar. Just go to learn, have fun. You can do the seminar as part of the certification process and do the certification stuff, all your studying, your testing online. So go check that out and come join us. Have some fun.
And you pay for the information and you get the wit and sarcasm for free.
Yes, that is one possible interpretation of that. I think the information is free and you pay for the entertainment.
Oh, okay.
The information that's secondary.
Yeah.
It's infotainment, as they say these days.
Yep.
All right.
That's what sells.
Yes. Okay. Well, is there any quick USA weightlifting news that we need to talk about?
Well, there is, and we didn't do, usually we have a pre-discussion.
We're just winging it today.
Yeah, we just fuck it. Well, I got reelected to the board for another 4 years as technical director.
I voted for you.
There's that. Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
And I still have to rerun for chair of the board in January at our first meeting. We'll select chair of the board. So I mean that becomes another 2-year term. So I'll run for that. And I had been selected by this current board previous to these elections to serve as IWF delegate. So I have since been to Tbilisi, Georgia, to Junior Worlds. Actually, I don't stay for the actual World Championships. I just go in for the meetings that happen prior to the event, just because of work schedule.
You just go for the nerdy stuff.
Yeah, I go for the actual Congress. And I went to Malaysia. It feels like it's a few weeks ago. I guess it has been a few weeks ago for Youth Worlds, and we had the Constitutional Congress. And so we passed a new constitution and bylaws for the IWF, which includes now this 90 kilo class that we've, I think, mentioned prior to this was a possibility. And so now there are 8 women's classes and 8 men's classes that will be contested from 2017 on. And of course, we're already incorporating that for the American Open because we're
so progressive.
We foresaw the changes being adopted. Additionally, they're adding a women's slot to the executive board. So now of the 16 seats, you'll have one of the slots having to be a female for vice president, and one just as an executive board member. And USA Weightlifting has put my name up for the executive board. So I'll run in that election come May.
Cool. And the other one that got voted in too is the body weight tiebreaker rule no longer exists. So you can't lift the same as somebody and beat them by being lighter in body weight. You have to actually lift more weight. And I don't personally understand a lot of the objections I've seen to that rule change. To me, it makes a lot of sense that in a sport called weightlifting, you have to win by lifting more weight. I mean, God forbid you lift weight in weightlifting to be better than the next person. Fuck. People will complain about anything.
Yes, this is true. I think when we look back at the old system of 2.5 kilos, where every jump was done by 2.5 to 5 kilos, like the minimum was a 2.5 kilo jump.
Yep.
The tiebreaker rule made a little bit more sense.
That's more understandable. I would agree with you.
Right, because it was significant. But once we moved to the 1 kilo rule, now you're able, standard for moving the weight up, and adopted all those sets and all had to buy new weights and everything else that went along with it. you really, it's hard to argue that, well, I mean, can't you just lift 1 kilo more
Yeah.
than the other person? It's not the bigger jump that you used to have to take with 2.5 kilos, which was fairly significant in terms of percent when you look at like a 48-kilo woman
Yeah, I was gonna
snatching.
say that's you get a 110 kilo dude adding 2.5 kilos. Who cares? But
Percentage
yeah, a
wise.
little 48 kilo gal, that seems a little bit much. I'm no
So,
mathematician, but I'm pretty sure that's about 60% of body weight.
in any case, you are no mathematician. I can verify.
Uh, all right, let's talk about various people's questions and make them happy. Well, actually, sometimes I'm sure we don't make them happy. They don't get the answer
Yeah, well,
they
I mean,
want. But
you get real rude. No, I'm kidding.
me,
Just fucking with
you're
you.
the one calling people babies for not lifting heavy weights. All right.
The
Bruno
alternative.
asks, why do my hips tend to shoot up when pulling in my clean, but not in my snatch? How can I correct that? I have a couple ideas, and of course, it's always tough with questions like this because there are always multiple possible reasons for this, and without seeing somebody lift, you kind of are guessing. So I'm sure Ursula will have more to add to this, but a couple different things. So first and foremost, usually what's happening when you see someone's hips shoot up is that for some reason the body is wanting to shift more of the work to the hips rather than the knees or the legs. So we call it unloading the legs. In other words, if you have that knee starting at a smaller angle, so the knee is bent more, it's not quite strong enough to open that knee joint from such a small angle and lift that weight completely. So by shifting the hips up, you open that angle of the knee more, going to reduce that mechanical disadvantage of that joint, shift more the work to the hips, and then you can move that weight. So you see the weight moving relatively little and then the hips moving relatively more to kind of shift into that stronger position. But this can be because you actually do have a strength imbalance. I was reading this as I was talking. It's always a bad idea. You have a strength imbalance between the legs and the hips, but it can also be things like starting in a poor position, and so your body has to shift. Like there's just no way it's going to lift, mechanically speaking. It has to reposition itself. And then there's things like issues of
And by
speed.
starting in a bad position, I would assume mean like starting with the hips so low that to even
Right. So like if
start
you're trying to
movement, yeah.
start with your hips so low that your shoulders are behind the bar, of course your hips are going to shoot up first because you can't lift a heavy bar with your shoulders behind it. It's not going to work.
Without moving around your knee.
Well, yeah.
Well, I mean, you would run into yourself
With a
if you
heavy
start
enough
moving.
weight, you're not even going to move it until your shoulders get above the bar. Unless you just pull backwards really hard initially. And
That's
it's
what I'm
going
saying,
to it's
you're
going
gonna
to
run
catch
into
up to you
yourself.
eventually though.
Yeah.
And then the last thing that comes to mind is, the speed. If you are yanking the bar off the floor, if you're just trying to accelerate as fast as possible immediately, you're going to see that even with someone who doesn't necessarily have a strength imbalance, that tendency is almost always going to be to unload the legs and shift the hips up. So if someone's in a huge rush off the floor, that's normally what you're going to see. And if you can get them to kind of control that position a little better and kind of generate more tension before they begin, then a lot of times it's corrected right there without having to do anything crazy like change the way you train to bring up that imbalance. So why would it happen in the clean versus the snatch? It, is a completely different question, but another couple guesses would be that number one, because the weights are heavier in the clean,
That's my first
yeah,
answer. It's
it's going to be a
heavier,
little
duh.
tougher, and so
Yeah.
it's going to start bringing out this issue more. It's going to make it more pronounced. Although, oddly enough, your hips are going to naturally be higher in the clean because of the narrower grip than in the snatch. So your knee's already in a somewhat mechanically better position, but I still think that you're going to see the shift being more pronounced just because of the heavier weights. And you kind of related to that too. If the weights are heavier, you may mentally be a little less confident and a little more prone to try to just rip it off the floor as hard as possible because you're convinced that there's no way it's going to get up there and you'll be able to get under it. So I could see a number of different things. what do you think about all this nonsense?
I think you don't need me in this discussion because you've like hit every point that I had and more. I mean, I agree with you completely. The one thing that maybe you didn't mention, so I mean, I have little keywords here down here like magnitude, which is, it's heavier. So then you would need to get stronger in the pull off the ground, and there's multiple ways of working on that. I put stance, the potential in the stance, which you mentioned. We're shifting from this wider stance to the narrow stance, which puts your hips up a little higher.
What you mean, stance or the grip?
Well, the stance moves with the grip. If your grip goes out, usually you widen your feet a tiny bit for the snatch, and then for me at least, I have a slightly different, about a quarter foot width difference between my stance for my snatch and my clean. Mm-hmm. So to get my knees into my elbows on my snatch, I have my toes out a little bit more and my feet a little bit wider. Gotcha. But I mean, the one thing that you didn't mention would be like where the foot pressure is. If you're a little bit towards the front of the foot, then that weight's going to have some advantage. So you want to make sure you're centered as you're driving off the ground. So if you're not paying attention, I see this a lot with beginners when they have only lifted light weights and they start lifting heavier weights that actually exceed their own body weight. They don't make the adjustment of making sure that as they're standing, that weight is staying centered on their foot. They will easily get pulled forward because with lightweight, that pressure on your foot doesn't matter as much. But as the weight gets heavier, it becomes even more important. I mean, you should practice it anyways. But that was the only point I think that that you didn't cover. That's
a good one though, because, well, actually two things. The stance width is a good point. Because if this guy, for example, does have two different stance widths for snatch and clean, especially if it's significant at all, that may also be contributing to kind of a reduced ability to maintain that same posture as he pulls. So he may be kind of discovering some relative weaknesses or strength imbalances with that stance. So that might be something, Bruno, you can experiment with is, try doing clean pulls and snatch pulls with somewhat different stance widths, or, how much you toe out, and kind of see where you feel stronger. And by that, I mean, not necessarily stronger, but stronger in the sense that you can maintain the position you're looking to maintain. And you may find that a wider stance, for example, makes it a little bit easier for you to stay upright, whereas a narrower stance kind of encourages that tipping. And then,
and toes straight can encourage tipping as well. It's why
nothing good comes of having your toes straight forward. Can I just say that, like, blanket statement? Don't do it.
Yeah, you can.
I can't take that shit.
You can't even.
I can't.
You want me to go get you your spice latte
Studies
right
show
now?
that 80% of white girls can't even right now.
No, I mean, I agree that there are people who start with toes straight for various reasons, and they have their reasons. But in general, it's going to create a disadvantage in overall displacement and how much you have to extend your knee back, which then this could be a result of that. If you have your toes straight, then you have to move your knees back more to pass them.
Yes.
And if you have a narrow stance, then that becomes even more pronounced. So that's, I think, something else to look at. I mean, that may be a reason. People have to remember that a clean pull, I think, is different than, I don't think it's different, I know it's different than a deadlift. And so when we get people transferring over into the sport, you all of a sudden, what you were mentioning about bar speed becomes an issue. Because you can't just rip it off the floor and do whatever. You have to make sure you're moving well. And so making sure that you separate with control and then start accelerating becomes important as well, so that you don't get pulled forward. And that goes back to pressure on the foot as well.
Yeah.
But sometimes you make that shift happen by yanking too quickly off the ground.
Well, I mean, honestly, when I was looking through these questions for 10 seconds before we started, that didn't even occur to me. But it's a great point also, that this idea of just simply being out of balance forward, and whether that's coming from a poor start position in terms of the actual body position, or if it's because, like you said, I think you teach the same thing. I teach, in the start position when the bar is still sitting on the floor, the weight should be balanced evenly across the whole foot.
Right.
And I think, we've kind of talked about similar things in past episodes where you're either going to have people who may start too far on the balls of the feet in that starting position, which means once they pull that bar off the floor, they get pulled even farther forward, which will naturally tip the hips up. But you have the opposite, people who are trying to start way back on their heels. And I mean, even during the pull, you shouldn't be that far back on your heels, but you certainly shouldn't be that far back on your heels in the start position. And so you end up having that overcompensation. So you start way back, and the second you add that bar to the system, all of a sudden you get rocked forward.
Yeah.
And so you're constantly trying to adjust and account for that. So I feel like there are quite a few possibilities, Bruno, for you to investigate. But hopefully that at least gives you a kind of guideline of where to start. But that definitely does.
I think it leads really well into that next question too.
Yeah, exactly.
Because we've almost started touching on when.
Because this one already made me think of a bunch of other stuff I hadn't thought of for this question. So, all right. Jeremiah asks, should knees out be taught rather than pushing knees back? Just to be clear, he's talking about.
Hold on, Greg. Do you want to give this guy some exercises, Bruno?
Ooh.
That he can.
I'm embarrassed. I'm embarrassed that we didn't even do that. So thank God.
No, you're here. I'm embarrassed for you. No, I'm kidding.
Well, what's new about that? Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
I'm going to give my favorite.
Okay.
let me go first.
Roadhouse Complex?
Yeah, Penley Rows. No, my favorite is...
I prefer barbell rows. It's harder to hold on to Glenn than a barbell.
This is true. Any human.
Yeah.
I like on the riser doing pulls and pausing at the platform height.
Yes.
I think it makes you really strong off the floor. And from somebody who is really weak off the floor.
Oh, I'm with you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And those floating pulls.
Ooh,
where you have to go back down.
Those are cool, especially if you really hate the athlete, because they'll just be miserable. But you know what? It's their own fault for not being good. So it's to help them. But yeah, so pulls and deadlift variations off of a riser, usually like 2 to 4 inches, I would say is what I tend to use. Do you ever really go higher than that?
No, we have 3 3/4. So it's not even really 3 inches.
I think people get carried away with that sometime and like, oh, well, if 3 inches is good, then 6 inches will be fantastic.
Well,
and all of a sudden they look like a
bar
question
smashing
mark.
Your feet.
Right. And they'll move it and then they can't set their back properly. So it really defeats the purpose. So trust me, 3 inches or so is going to make it miserable enough. You don't have to get carried away. So any variation on a riser is going to help strengthen the legs for that initial movement off the floor. And then, like Ursula said, that pause. If you're standing on a riser, if you pause right at what would be normal platform height, so you're looking, the plates are moving 2 to 3, 4 inches or so off the ground, and then hold that, and then either continue into a pull or a deadlift, whatever you're doing. What I call floating pulls, where basically your first pull or deadlift would be normal, but then on the subsequent pulls, you're lowering that bar basically as close to the floor as you can get it without allowing it to touch. Sometimes we'll add a pause in there too, sometimes not. But the great thing about that too is that it really teaches that combination of balance and posture too, because you can't just drop the bar once it gets to your shins and then keep it moving quickly enough off the floor to kind of skip that bottom piece where you never really have to be totally balanced. So you kind of shoot yourself in the foot by not training that part.
5-second eccentrics.
Yeah.
And making sure the last 3 seconds are from the knee down.
And making sure, this is the one that kills me. That's the big part there. I did a video on that recently, is actually controlling it all the way to the floor. Not 5 seconds to right below the knee and then all of a sudden just like shitting your pants and collapsing. Because then you're literally missing the most important part. But then also making sure that you're actually in the right position. I'll see over and over and over again. You'll have people come off the floor in the right position, and then they'll basically just do a reverse RDL to get it down. So in other words, they just bend at the hip. They barely move the knees, rather than kind of bending at the hip to get into that good position over the bar, and then bringing the knees and hips down all together in the exact same posture you want to be pulling in from the floor. So that the whole point is, strength is very position and movement specific. So if you're doing these in a position that you don't want to be lifting in, you're just wasting your time. And not only that, it's actually counterproductive, because then you're strengthening a bad pattern that your body is going to revert to as soon as the weight gets heavy enough. So just do it right. What else? You know what? Honestly, the other thing that is not as closely related, but pause back squats. Again, though, using your proper position, and that's going to help develop that ability to really generate force with the legs and keep that posture up, and that going from a dead stop or even off of pins, in a power rack or off of blocks, however you want to set it up, so that you've got that concentric movement from a dead stop with no elastic help there. All good for that. Oh, and the pause right off the floor, I think is good even without a riser. The moment you break, if you tell people 1 inch, they're going to stop 6 inches off the floor. So I started telling people more often, the moment you feel the plate separate, stop. And that'll get you closer to 1 inch in most cases. And those
we do some combo
miserable
stuff too, like, pull to above the knee plus pull to power position, stuff like that. Like just doing more work from the ground.
Right. Well, and what we talked about is a lot of strength stuff, but doing variations of the actual, snatches and cleans where you can pause 1 inch off the floor and then do a clean, or you can pause 1 inch off, pause at the knee and then clean, or you can, do a pause pull back to the floor and then a clean. You can do a clean or a snatch with, a 3 to 5 second pull from the floor to mid thigh before you explode. There's a lot of different ways you can, force yourself to control that position, in the actual lift, rather than
one of the dangers of doing them in pulls is if you're always getting pulled forward, like, you have to bring your percentage down to make sure you're doing it correctly and you can hold the position.
Yeah, well, and
you have to be patient and building up slowly.
Yeah, the thing too you got to remember though is people freak out about that. Well, like, I can only do this with 80%. It's like, well, okay, I'm sure that sucks. It's embarrassing for you to be in the gym with all the girls looking at you only doing 80%, which for some people is 50 kilos. But the thing is it's better to do less weight correctly, especially initially, than to do more weight incorrectly. Because again, like I said earlier, if you're doing it incorrectly, you're just reinforcing the problem. You're just making it harder and harder and harder to fix that problem. So you're better off doing pulls at 60% properly and building back up the right way than to just keep hitting yourself in the face with a hammer at 90% and accomplishing absolutely nothing. So
yeah, that's where the check your ego at the door mentality comes in.
Yes. Or just leave it at home. Don't even bring it in the car ride to the gym. All right. The ego check. Do you get a little card?
Probably get a little less road rage.
Yes. Okay. Are we ready for Jeremiah now?
We're ready for Jeremiah.
All right. Jeremiah asks, should knees out be taught rather than pushing knees back? Two athletes that come to mind when sorry, I all of a sudden sounded German. When visualizing this difference is Ilya Ilyin and Jared Fleming in the clean specifically. So Ilya would be the one who's pushing his knees back, and Jared would be the one who's pushing his knees out, for those of you who aren't familiar with them. If each method has its place for specific athletes, what key factors should be taken into consideration, such as limb and torso length or athletic capability in general? You want to kick this one off? Are you eager?
I'll say this much first. Ilyin is anomalous, and his pull path is a little anomalous too. Like he starts with a low hip, but he's got a long torso. He uses a lot of leg off the ground, and then so we see a bigger opening of the knee because of the lower hip start. So you have to kind of keep that in mind.
I would say both of those lifters are fairly anomalous, the way they move.
Yeah, Jared has kind of an excessive flare, and I guess it's probably why we see those two being mentioned.
Right.
As he stands, we see. I mean, the one thing about Jared that I would say is different is that the back angle's static.
Yes.
And I think that's what we're made, that's where we get the knees out versus knees back. When you hold that back angle static, you're essentially in the hang position from the floor, and you're able to just stand up and maintain that position as you come up. And he does that by flaring his knees out as opposed to back. I do a little of both. So, I mean, I go back and out when I pull. I don't do just one or the other. And depending on the athlete, some athletes with really, with not good proportions, both of these guys have good proportions for the sport. But I think in terms of anthropometrics, when I have somebody with longer legs, I tend to have them move out, because if not, the amount that they'll have to move their knees back ends up being so much that it's hard for them to accelerate, because it slows the bar down when you push your knee back.
Right. Well, and it'll tip them way over too, especially a long-legged athlete. So yeah, I'm with you 100%. I think that it's not necessarily one or the other. And I do think that both those guys are kind of extreme examples of both ends of the spectrum. And it is a spectrum. You don't have to pick one or the other. They're not warring camps. Like, you get to do whatever balance of the two is going to be best for you. So I would say, generally speaking, in the starting position, snatch or clean, I want the feet turned out a bit, and I want the knees basically pushed out as far as the elbows will allow. So the knees are inside the elbows. Which is really not that much for most people. Unless you have an extremely wide snatch grip, it's really not that much. But what that does is it effectively shortens the length of your femur. So, Ursula, you mentioned this earlier. If your feet are straight forward and your knees are pointed straight forward, your hips are the farthest back they can possibly be in a start position, right? Because you have that femur also, perfectly straight.
With what you're describing, in both, like if you have your toes straight and your knees forward, it puts the centers of the mid distance of the centers of mass is further apart. Right. So you're
Our
in
system's
terms
all
of
spread out.
Yeah. So it actually makes the weight feel heavier, because your two centers of mass of you and the barbell are further apart. That's why one of the many reasons in biomechanics that you have the toes slightly out and the knees out, and try to get the torso closer to the bar so that you can shorten the distance between the two masses.
Right. Yeah, you're shortening all the lever arms involved, which, for those of you who have any understanding of basic mechanics, means that it's easier to move things. So if you have someone who has extremely long legs, like Ursula just said, you're probably going to really have to keep those knees out in the start position. A wider stance also might kind of help, in a sense, kind of shorten the legs, because because they're out at more of an angle. You have a little bit you're taking up a little bit of that length, kind of giving it some place to go. And then those people still may have to, tip over the bar slightly more than a better proportion lifter. In other words, those knees still have to travel back a little more. Although with a taller athlete, you also tend to have a larger foot, which means that bar will start a little bit farther, forward. So even if that bar is still over the ball of the foot, like we would ideally want it in the perfectly proportioned person, that's still farther away from the ankle than it would be with a smaller footed person. But you also see, even this goes back to Soviet literature, decades old. You'll tend to have people with shorter torso and longer legs. The recommendation is that the bar has to start slightly farther forward over the feet. This doesn't mean 3 inches in front of your toes, guys. Settle down. It just means maybe you get a little bit farther forward so you have a little bit more clearance. And that's something you can experiment with. But, the whole system in any case has to be adjusted to kind of optimize whatever you're working with. Optimize the suboptimal proportions, if you will.
Yeah, and it being the suboptimal here would be, the long leg and the short torso, where even if you shorten the femur length by taking out the knee angle, you're still not over the bar because the torso is too short.
Right.
And that's why, the mesomorphs or the brachymorph body type that has the short leg and the long torso is just easier, because you're not having to create all of these angle changes as you pull. You can hold static positions. And that's the one, obviously Ilya is, in terms of his quality for known reasons, has lifted a lot more than Jared. Jared's positions tend to hold those static angles better and actually lend themselves to a little bit better mechanics and pull from the floor to the hip.
Right. And so
in terms of efficiency.
Yeah, I mean, my recommendation across the board, though, is that I want to see people minimize the amount of back angle change during the pull. In other words, if you're a taller person or a longer-legged person, I might have you start with your shoulders slightly farther forward over the bar than I would a better proportion person, where I'm going to probably put them almost directly above the bar, because they'll be able to actually continue the pull with that approximately same back angle, whereas the taller person might have to shift more. And you start adding that shift, and the larger the magnitude of that shift, the more potential problems you encounter with maintaining balance and, moving the bar, towards the body properly, and the timing and
getting a sudden load on the back.
Right. There's all these different variables that you start adding to the mix that you don't need. Weightlifting is hard enough as it is. Like, don't complicate it more than you need to. As weights get heavier, you're almost always going to have at least a slight change in back angle, and that's fine. It's not the end of the world. When you hear someone like me or anyone else say we want to keep the same back angle from the floor to, lower thigh, mid thigh, whatever, we're not saying it has to be precise to, a tenth of a degree. We just want it approximately the same. We want to see that you're not seesawing your way up there and doing all kinds of ridiculous stuff. Constantly adjusting and readjusting and all these different things. Now, all that having been said, I do think that it is almost always unnecessary to do either one of these things, and that is push the knees back intentionally to an extreme degree, or push them farther out to an extreme degree as you're pulling. In other words, to me, the amount that the knees are out should be maximum in that start position and shouldn't increase. And then as the bar passes the knees will naturally come back in line with the feet, as you would see in a squat, because the body's readjusting and getting you into a better position mechanically to, create as much force against the ground as possible for that upward acceleration. What we see, I think, is the reason I don't like the knees back cue is because I think a lot of times it gets people to do it excessively. And I always make a joke at my seminars. Yeah, exactly. So you get this really excessive sudden tip where all of a sudden their back is horizontal, and they're just doing a stiff-legged deadlift, or as we like to say, your hips are so high that your head is up your ass.
You're looking at these like sudden knee angle changes, or even knee angle changes. Period. You have to remember that if the hips are moving up, then the bar is staying in the same position.
Right.
Unless the shoulders are moving faster, which doesn't happen. So we're always looking for that tip that tells us the bar slowed down. And so there's a big effect there in terms of speed and acceleration when you see that tip. And it will, besides the weight shift, it will impact kind of your final velocity and definitely your acceleration graph.
Yeah, so the joke I constantly make at my seminars when we talk about this pull off the floor is that how do you get your knees back out of the way of the bar? You stand up.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, because your knee starts forward of the bar. So if I'm standing, it's moving back.
Yeah, as your knee extends, the knee moves backwards. It has to. And so, obviously there are exceptions to this based on, some fairly extreme proportions where you are going to have to shift a little bit and kind of move the knees somewhat farther back a little earlier than you might want to. But these are usually relatively minor. It's not some extreme thing where all of a sudden you're lock-kneed when the bar is at the level of the knees. That's a huge problem, I think. And so if you are in the right start position, and by that your hips are at the right level, your shoulders in the right position relative to the bar, you're balanced properly, the foot is, you're balanced over the foot properly, and the bar is in the right position relative to the foot. If you stand up and you stay balanced properly and you keep that back angle correct, which is, approximately the same as where you started, your knees will be out of the way of the bar by the time the bar gets to them.
That's
So
why finding the right start position for every single person is so important, because then you really can tell them just stand up with the bar and everything just happens.
yeah. And that's the thing is, you end up overcomplicating it and putting these people in these crazy positions, and all of a sudden they get strong in these poor positions, and so again the body reverts to wherever it's strongest as the weight goes up, and so then you have this problem that's just it's self-perpetuating. And then the knees out thing too is kind of a similar problem where you end up to an extreme where now people have their knees so far out that they have such an upright torso position that they don't even have enough of a moment at the hip to really get some good acceleration. The hips are important. We talk about legs all the time because most people forget about them. They're just these things that like hold their cute shoes on. But you get the knees way out, and a lot of times it's to the point where people are rocking onto the outside edges of their feet, so that full foot isn't even in contact, which means you can't produce as much force, or their torso is so upright that they lose that ability to really accelerate a lot with the hip, or that it actually causes them to begin opening the hip prematurely, so their shoulders are behind the bar really soon in the pull. So in either case, you have a lot of potential problems, and in my humble opinion, you want to try to find, again, that position, the starting position that allows you to maintain a relatively static back angle through the first pull, while you are able to maintain balance and put yourself in a hang position that's going to give you this optimal ability to accelerate and stay balanced throughout the rest of the lift. Rather than resorting to some crazy thing where you push your knees so far back, your head goes up your ass, or you push your knees so far out that it looks like you're doing a sumo snatch or something crazy like that.
Well, you have to be careful there because there's no structural support. When you push your knee so far out that it's no longer aligned with the what would be the line of the femur to the tibia, you've got an issue because you're putting this lateral pressure on the knee that is excessive. So, I generally look to make sure that, the femur line is still over the foot. Like, you don't want it so far out that it's unsupported.
Right.
In terms of structural support.
Yes.
And some people are bow-legged, and so they kind of look like that anyways.
Well, yeah, and that's a good point too, though, is that, we talk about all these things in kind of ideals or averages, or this kind of theoretical person, and so you do have a lot of variation among human beings. Unfortunately, it makes this stuff more difficult, and people will say, well, I look very different than that guy, and that may be true, but you may also be doing the exact same thing. You may be hitting those same criteria that we're talking about, and your back angle is going to be different, or your stance is going to be different, and that's fine. Again, you do have to adjust and change things somewhat in order to optimize things for yourself. And like in the new edition of my book, I added a bunch of pictures early on. So talking about starting position or rack position or squat position, and I would have like pictures of 9 different athletes in that position, just to show the variation, where it's like, look, these 9 people are all meeting the criteria we're teaching. Shoulder in the same position relative to the bar in the same position relative to the foot, blah blah blah. But they all look slightly different, and that's fine. Like, you have to be able to recognize when those criteria are met, where those standards are met, and yet the appearance may change.
Sure.
All right.
Absolutely. So,
Finally, we're going to get into something totally different.
I don't know that we have to give him any exercises. We're not really correcting anything here. I would say that don't be afraid on the front end as a coach to experiment with start position to see how you can get the person to stand up with the most subtle knee angle change, so that we don't get that shooting hip or too much flare.
Right.
I generally, people come in and they have a start position, and it's one of the things I'll start fiddling with just to see if I can get them to an optimal start position. And so, I might have them change the foot angle slightly, of course, all within the realm of something that feels somewhat natural. Of course, we can't rely on that completely, because these lifts don't necessarily feel natural at the beginning. And that's when you're trying to just use your experience as a coach to make some kind of decisions for them as to what makes them move the most efficiently so that you minimize the stress on them.
Yeah. It doesn't have to be comfortable. It has to be right. You know what I mean? Like you don't have to, people talk about it all the time. It's like, well, there's nothing natural about snatching and clean and jerking a barbell. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, there are certain parts of that movement you could say are somewhat natural, like squatting in general, but it is not a natural thing. It's very not paleo to snatch and clean and jerk. So, don't try to like make that fit into some framework of something that's totally unrelated.
Well, and somebody immobile is going to say, "Oh, sitting deeper in my start position, it doesn't feel right."
That's
well,
your
of course
fault for
it doesn't,
not doing gymnastics as a child.
Yeah, it's because your ankles don't dorsiflex.
Yeah. Okay. We ready for Robert?
I'm ready for Robert.
Speaking of fancy shoes, Robert asks, I currently lift and do everything else in chucks. I will probably never lift competitively, but I do enjoy PRs. This is why I write, because I can edit instead of speaking and sounding like an idiot. Should I invest in a pair of weightlifting shoes or continue on with chucks? Depth and mobility aren't much of an issue, so I would imagine the benefit would be more to my weak squat strength. I'm not sure actually how that is a benefit.
Well, I think he's talking about maybe if he, lifts his heel and he could potentially squat more, which I would say this
probably
is
not, especially
for me.
if he's been squatting in chucks his whole life.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Maybe not, right? He's never had to use his quads as much. I don't. For me, this is an easy one. Yeah, you get shoes. I mean, I don't even know. This is a question.
It is. This is such a bizarre question. Because Robert,
I think for us it's kind of the obvious. It's there is a thing. I mean, there is the potential that like maybe you get shoes with too high of a heel and you feel a little bit more stress in your knee if you have a flexible ankle. I mean, there are some things that could happen here. But I mean, overall, the stability that you get from a weightlifting shoe. I mean, the weightlifting shoe construction is not just a matter of the heel height. That's one
what
of
I wanted to talk about. Yeah.
It's also, it's a little wider around the foot. Like, so you get some lateral support from it as well, which you wouldn't get in a chuck. I don't know. I don't wear chucks, but
it's definitely a broader base for sure.
Yeah. So there's more lateral base besides the heel height. And I think people get like hyper focused on heel height, which there's a benefit to that as well, in terms of alleviating the ankle mobility that's required. But you also get the stability of a more sturdy shoe that's not canvas, that can't roll around.
Well, yeah. So to me, okay, well, let me just do the short answer. Yes, Robert, get weightlifting shoes. This is like asking your football coach if you should wear cleats. You know what I mean? Honestly, it's like asking if you should use a barbell. Like, these are the tools of the sport and of the activity. So yes, use them.
And you should use round weights on your barbell.
Yeah. Don't use globe barbells from 1906. It is
square weights though.
Oh yeah. Well, like the hexagonal ones?
Yeah.
Or the octagonal ones?
They were rectangular. They were rectangular.
Doesn't make any sense at all.
In Malaysia, no, they were on the top of a hill, so it does make sense.
Oh, okay, that makes sense.
But when you turn it over, it created all sorts of force on the bar that was really bizarre. Anyways, I'm sorry, I got off topic.
That must be the conjugate method. That's West Side.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, the heel height is, like Ursula said, one of many elements here. And so you say depth and mobility aren't much of an issue, but I would argue that even if you are mobile enough to sit into a full depth squat without weightlifting shoes, it may be that your torso angle is more forwardly inclined than it should be for, a better clean and overhead squat position. So you may be able to hit a good depth, but in order to do so, you may be sitting farther back and leaning farther forward,
and loading the back.
Yeah, which is a terrible position, structurally to support a heavy clean or even a heavy snatch. So that's one thing. Heel height, it may not be an issue of depth and mobility so much, but more of just general position, like trunk position primarily. So consider that, first of all. I can sit into a pretty damn good squat with flat shoes or barefoot, but I'm still a lot more comfortable in weightlifting shoes, and I don't see a need not to wear them. The stability thing is huge. So you have, you might as well wrap your feet in newspaper and then put a couple layers of duct tape on the bottom. That's essentially what a Chuck Taylor is. I mean, yeah, if you're playing basketball in Indiana in 1955, Chuck Taylors are the perfect shoe because that's the best they had. That's 70 years ago. Move on. Like, we got better stuff. If you have...
I think it comes over from, besides CrossFit, that, they do stuff in their Metcon shoes that don't have much of a heel. But also like powerlifting, because you'll see people who, deadlift in ballet shoes or Chuck Taylors or wrestling boots or something that don't have a heel.
Don't need that much stability.
Right, it's not the same sport. This is a sport, and it has equipment that has been developed specifically. That's like saying I'm not going to use a bar that rotates because I was a power lifter. It's like, go ahead, tear your wrist and elbow off.
Right.
But
luck.
We have this equipment that's been developed and devised to optimize your performance, and it just seems outside of normal thought process to think, I don't need it. I mean, first of all, it's a little egotistical to think I don't need it, but second of all, I was like, why would you not use the advantage of the equipment that you can? I mean, people buy Alico bars for the advantage that you get from the elasticity and the rotation of the bar instead of lifting on, a Texas Power bar or something. So, I mean, women use a women's bar to gain the advantage and the grip that you have from a more solid grip on the bar. So, I mean, it just seems like this is one of the cheaper kind of options that we have in terms of optimizing performance.
Yeah, you buy a good pair of shoes. That's going to last you for years. I know people who've lifted for 15 years on the same pair of shoes.
Mine are from 1992.
Yeah, you get them resold a couple times, you're totally fine. Just don't buy shitty shoes. But yeah, so heel height aside, you have the stability of the shoe, the upper of the shoe, which is going to help keep your foot in place. But you have that broad base that we talked about. And so you look at powerlifting, squat, deadlift, it's a slow movement. Your feet don't ever move. You don't need the same amount of stability. And for the deadlift, these guys are trying to get as close to the floor as possible so that the bar is as high relative to their body as possible, because that quarter of an inch makes a difference if you're trying to deadlift 1,000 pounds. But the thing is, too, when you have these dynamic movements where you're lifting and moving your feet in particular, that stability is incredibly important. I watch people try to lift in running shoes is the worst. Worse than Chuck Taylors. But it looks like they're trying to lift on a fucking room full of marshmallows. Like, you're just asking to get hurt, and there's no benefit to it all. There's no good reason to not use them, and a ton of reasons to use them. And then finally, even a Chuck Taylor with a relatively thin sole still has a lot of give to it. They're pretty squishy in the bottom. Versus a weightlifting shoe, which is very firm. The sole of that shoe is extremely firm, which means that more of the force that you're producing with your body is getting to the floor, which means it's getting back up into the bar. So more of the work you're doing is actually, producing movement and speed and acceleration, all these things. So there's literally no good reason to not use weightlifting shoes unless you genuinely can't afford them, in which case you didn't need to ask the question anyway. So I would say buy a pair of shoes.
Right.
Is that fair?
Okay. Yeah, that's fair.
I hope that wasn't too offensive, Robert, but get some fucking shoes. Years and years ago when I was helping Mike Bergner when he was doing CrossFit weightlifting seminars, I would help coach him. And there was a guy who tried to do the whole seminar barefoot. And I told him, I don't remember being very nice about it either. I told him that he had to wear shoes. I was like, I don't care what kind of shoes they are, but you're not doing this shit barefoot.
Yeah.
Good God, man.
Like,
if you want to lift barefoot, that's fine. Go do it outside with sticks and rocks and no chalk. but
It's like Survivor weightlifting.
yeah, fudge. All right. Let's we might run a little over, but I don't care. Let's do this one.
I was like, we're at an hour.
Nah, we're at 50 minutes. We're going to give the people what they want.
Oh, our call's at an hour. I guess we must have blabbed for a bit before we got on.
All right. Nick asks, how do you prioritize training versus coaching? I'm in a stage right now where coaching takes up a lot of my time and my own training has to be planned around my coaching. I love my coaching and I love making people better, but at the same time, I love training and miss the days when it was just me and doing my thing. I have a full-time job as well, so it's a juggling act. Do I prioritize training and work my clients around my training? Most of them are beginners, so I'm very hands-on when they are lifting. Have you experienced this? Can I be both a good coach and a good athlete? This one's very near and dear to my heart, honestly, because I've been in this position for a long time.
Yeah, me too. Well, I gave up being an athlete for being a coach. I did, for the first 5 years, I was, from 90, I guess it's longer, from 93 to end of 92 to 2000, I was doing both. I had a really small group of lifters, though.
Right.
And they were all good level. So, I mean, teaching beginners is exhausting in terms of you have to demonstrate a lot. You have to put a lot of time and effort in. I would argue that as you go along and you have more elite lifters, you tend to have the ability to sit down some as opposed to standing up the whole time and constantly showing things or correcting.
No, that looks like shit. Do it like me.
Right. And so you end up, I think teaching beginners is a lot more effortful in terms of physical exertion and mental exertion than teaching higher level lifters. And so I had at least the benefit of most of the lifters I was dealing with being national level or above when I was doing both. Yeah. But I would say you can be good at both, but I think you're always going to be giving something up in one of them. So you're not going to necessarily you can't be full effort in both, in my opinion.
100% agreed.
Yeah. So you have to prioritize, like, are you more interested in being a great athlete or a great coach? Because you can be a good athlete and a good coach, but we're talking about if I'm assuming you would like to be better than you are, or one of the best, or at least strive towards that. And if that's your goal, then I would say you have to prioritize. When I first started coaching, I wasn't necessarily coaching to become the best coach. I was coaching because those people around me needed a coach. And I took something from them as a coach to also be an athlete. And then when I refocused on just being a coach, I inevitably became a much better coach than I was in the initial years, because now my devotion was towards the profession of coaching. So I know there was, and I also feel like when I was trying to coach them, I gave up some as an athlete as well. So absolutely. I probably became mediocre at both, as opposed to being really great at one of them. And so I would say that I was a good coach and a good athlete, but I was neither a great athlete nor a great coach during that period. So I think you have to prioritize, like, which one do you want to be great at? What's your real, and some of that has to do with your own athletic ability. Like, assess your own athletic ability. Do you have an athlete that could be far superior to you as an athlete? And if so, it might, and you want to be a great coach, that might be your opportunity to become a great coach, or to be recognized as a coach. And you don't want to miss that opportunity because you're too selfish. Being an athlete is a selfish endeavor. Being a coach is a selfless endeavor. And so they just don't tend to blend.
Yeah.
You can do both. We both do both.
Absolutely.
But,
a lot of people do both, but
sure.
100% agree. You do have to prioritize one or the other. You have to sacrifice some part of one of those or some part of both of them. So Ursula makes the perfect point. Give yourself an honest evaluation. Can you be a great weightlifter? And if so, is that what you want? Because if you can be, and if you want to be, you need to not be a serious coach for now. Especially if you have a full-time job. As a matter of fact, being a coach at all is probably a terrible idea. Like if you have, let's say you reasonably could, win a national championship or, make a world team or a Pan Am team. It's not a good time to be a coach. It's a good time to focus because you have a limited window of time. You know, you can't turn 40 and be like, okay, now I'm going to get serious about weightlifting as an athlete. No, done. You're fucked. You know, you can get on TRT and go win masters if you want, but you know, you're not going to go make a world team. Actually, wasn't there was a Hungarian guy like a year or two ago at Worlds who was 40 years old. That was pretty crazy.
There was one at the Olympics.
Yeah, maybe that's what I'm thinking
And there, at the World Championships, Adiev, one of Akhudov's first coaches, won a medal at the World Championships at like 38.
That's pretty awesome.
And Ternyenko made the Olympic team in '96 at 38,
Nice.
but then didn't compete in Atlanta. Yeah, there's been examples of people who were, and he had been working as a coach in India in between that.
That worked out. So anyway, you know, if that's the case, you do have to make a decision. You have to absolutely commit to one or the other if you want to be the absolute best you can be at either one. And so, you know, I was both. I was competing, you know, I did a number of American Opens and national championships as both a coach and an athlete. And I had big teams. You know, I had 10 to 14 lifters at a competition and was lifting myself. And that's really, really difficult to do. And they were the priority. And my lifting absolutely suffered because of it. And I knew going into it, I was not going to do as well as I would otherwise be able to do. But I accepted that because I love lifting. I love training. I sort of like competing. And so it was worth it to me to continue to train as a lifter and compete as a lifter below what I knew was my absolute best in order to make sure that I was putting everything I could into coaching. And so I was fortunate enough to be in a position where my job allowed me a little more flexibility in terms of training time and, you know, being able to both coach and train and not having a full-time job that was outside of a gym, for example, and, you know, having people who actually helped run the gym business and things like that. So you make that decision. And then if you decide that you do want to be a coach, that doesn't mean you have to stop training. It just means you have to reevaluate what your goals are and you know, make sure that they're reasonable. You don't have contrary goals like I want to win the national championship and I want to have a national championship weightlifting team. You're not going to do both of those. It would be very, very, very difficult to do, and I really don't foresee that happening. But if you say, I want to have a national championship team and I want to continue competing at whatever level I can while being fully committed to my athletes, then by all means, that is what you should do.
Yeah. I actually would encourage, like if you are a newer athlete and a newer coach, I think that the experience you get functioning as an athlete is fairly invaluable.
Oh, absolutely.
So, I mean, I would encourage any coach to be some measure of an athlete at some level, actually first.
Yeah.
Or if that they can't manage that and they've already started coaching, then alongside your coaching duties. But of course, at that point, you're putting yourself second. So your training isn't priority. Your athlete's training becomes priority, and you're second. So, like, I mean, when I do train, I train pretty much at the tail end of everyone else's training at the end of the day.
Right.
So, like 7:30, 8 o'clock at night, sometimes 8:30, I start training.
When
I feel
super
like
energetic and motivated.
Yes, when everybody is on their pulls and squats and I can fit something in.
Yeah.
Because if I take up platform space and or take my attention or focus away from them, that impacts them. And so I, have prioritized that coaching comes first, and being whatever measure of an athlete I have left in me comes next, or is pretty much dead last.
Right.
And so, working, obviously if you have to work a full-time job to support yourself, that would probably be pretty high up there on the list. You can't give that up. And so, if you want to be a coach, then that comes next. And then, so now you're back burnering yourself here but it's still worth, getting some training in and having the same experience that your athletes have in terms of competition experience, even if it's just at a local level, so that you have some measure of compassion and empathy for what an athlete goes through, and what your programs do to people in terms of tearing them up. You may want to put yourself under that same stress for some period of time at least. And but in terms of can I be both a good coach and good athlete, to me that reads mediocre. Like good is mediocre in my book. You want to be great at one of them. I would assume we all do.
Absolutely.
And so, and it may be that you're great at one at some point in your career, and then you're great at the other at another point in your career. But trying to be, the best of both of them is difficult. And when we do see our really high-level athletes, which we have a lot of them that have gotten into coaching, one of the things that just is a pet peeve of mine is seeing them in the coaching, the session before they lift. It's like you realize that, you may think you're, impervious to the effects of that, but you're not.
No.
Like this actually does affect your performance ultimately. And so then that they're probably not as serious about their athletic performance if they're coaching the day before they lift and the day that they lift. And, it's in those cases, you're having to hand your athletes off to somebody who you can trust to coach them. And that's always a better option if you're a serious competitive athlete than going in and trying to do everything where you're actually taking away from your own performance. If you have the chance to perform at a really high level, that window of the ability to perform at a high level for an athlete is much smaller than the window to perform as a great coach.
Absolutely.
Right?
And I think too, the other thing about that is there are a lot more people. Make your secretary get the phone. There are a lot more people who can become great coaches than who can become great weightlifters. In other words, being a great weightlifter is to a great extent dependent on, who your parents are, what you happen to be born with. Were you born with great proportions? Were you born with, a lot of fast twitch muscle fiber, blah, blah, blah. Versus being a great coach, I think is more a product of being willing and able to spend time and effort learning and, gaining experience and practicing. So you don't have to be born with certain natural abilities necessarily to become a great coach. You can be a self-made great coach. There's more of a chance of you doing that than becoming a self-made great weightlifter who doesn't necessarily have naturally the physical tools necessary to do that. So not only is the window small, but the probability that you have what it takes is smaller. So if you're really not sure that's what you want to do, then you're probably better off really focusing more on coaching. And I hope that doesn't sound horribly like cynical and discouraging to everybody, but what can I say?
Yeah, I mean, it is what it is.
It's not my fault your parents didn't produce a good weightlifter. They should have done more genetic modification.
Yeah. Part of my genome project.
Yeah. The Human Genome Project. That's just reproduction.
Well, I have the Texas Barbell Genome Project. It's beyond reproduction.
There you go.
It's encouraging the proper pair of people
genetically
to reproduce.
modified organisms through breeding.
Yeah. GMO weightlifters.
All right. Well, I think we got it all.
I think so.
Guys, go to iTunes, go to Google Play or whatever you listen on. Review this thing. Review it nicely. Don't review it if you don't like it. If you don't like it, stop listening and wasting your time. If you love it, go and give us, a good rating, good review. We appreciate it. Go check out those seminars, catalystathletics.com. Hit the seminars education link up at the top. Check out the schedule. Check out the information. Any final words until next time, Ursula?
Nope. It's been a hell of a day.
It has indeed. All right, guys. We'll talk to you next time.